Welcome, everybody, to the Divine Council Worldview podcast. We're your hosts, but not maybe of this episode. Rich and Mel, here to tell you about an event sponsored by the Michael S. Heiser Foundation and Drina over there that will be happening May 2nd and 3rd. It's called the Image Conference. It'll be at New Purpose Ministries in Anderson, Indiana.
All this information will be listed. The link for the registration will be there. It's at the Michael S. Heiser Foundation.org. Go there, look under the events tab, and you'll see it. There's a form to fill out. Again, it's free. There's no cost. There's even some recommendations for some hotels there in the area. So we look forward to seeing people. We look forward to talking to people, connecting, and having some really good conversations. Really look forward to it.
Welcome to the Divine Council Worldview podcast. In this episode, we will talk our way through Genesis 18, a story which leads me to ask this question, Mike. Just happened this week. I was listening to a podcast. Well, I think I can mention it. It's Bill Maher's Club Random podcast, and he often interviews people, of his ilk who are at least strong agnostic, if not atheist. And here's the question that came out in that podcast where he even referenced Genesis 18. Okay. Why is it? Here's my question. Why is it that when some people read the Bible, they come away saying, as Maher did, this is silly, this is foolish, this is unintelligent material that no self-respecting person would read, let alone believe even happened? That was what he said about Genesis 18. And I thought, well, then how come others like you and I, we read the same material as we're going to do here today, and we say, this is interesting, if not even informative for how I think about the world and God and so forth. Here's my thoughts, and then, of course, Mike, give me your off-the-cuff response. I don't think the difference between me and an agnostic like Bill Maher is a matter of intelligence. I mean, he's smarter than me, probably. I don't even think it's a matter of being a better person or less proud. I mean, God knows I'm proud. I am thinking it's going down instead, though, a path of deciding to be respectful to the kind of literature that we confront in the Bible. In other words, that's the angle that I think will answer that question of why the radical difference between how we react to the Bible. So what I'm saying then, I guess, would be this. And this is part of a Divine Council worldview that I always want to press our listeners to think about, that reading the Bible as though you were the original audience, you would not experience its stories like Genesis 18 to come here as silly, but as real and honest and serious as tomorrow's newspaper. Because, again, think of all the odd stories we've covered in our study so far in Genesis. A God who creates the world by mere thought. A snake who talks, a cherubim waving a sword in front of a tree, giants born to human women who were impregnated somehow by the gods, a worldwide flood. We can go on and on. So what I'm saying is, if I had been there in any of those stories, I would not have said, as Bill Maher says, this is weird. I would have said, again, knowing what they knew, believing what they believed, experiencing life as they lived it, I would have come away from all of those stories saying, well, it's not weird, certainly noteworthy, certainly odd maybe for how my world has been working, but it's not weird. It's very informative, and I have to think my way through it based on, or work my day according to how, to what happened. And so is that making sense, Mike? I was just struck by that moment in that podcast where he's making fun of the Bible, and I wasn't offended because I know how Bill Maher thinks, but I was struck by, well, how come I'm a self-respecting person and I don't think it's weird at all? I think it's informative. So what say ye?
I suspect actually there are a lot more people in churches that probably think similarly to Bill Maher, because I think I get what you meant about pride, or there is no pride in the response, or because it's just an acknowledgement we are human. I think what the first thought that comes in my mind is that he is responding like a typical 21st century Westerner. I mean, there's no way around that, because so one of the things that I have been doing recently has been reading all these preaching books to get ready for my doctorate program cohort starting up soon. And one of the things that I've been reading about was the importance of narrative, of story. And all these preachers, all these homiletical preachers, they're all pointing back to how story is a fundamental human experience. And that the Western concept of this very specific way of doing history, of how you record history, how you tell history, or even just the ways that we present information through outlines and bullet points and indentations, like all that is actually more modern inventions and not natural to our minds. Our minds don't naturally think of in outlines. We don't think of our histories as I was born point A underscore that.
That's very true.
Then there was a little arrow, I was born by this mom and this father. He was, we don't think that way. When we tell our histories, we bring up a story, or we create a story on the fly from other stories that we have in our memories. And so when I read Genesis 18, all this is for me, for any self-respecting person, is to understand that this is a mode of communication that is not dumb, but actually very sophisticated, because being a good storyteller to keep an audience's attention takes a lot of work, and it's very difficult. I mean, you and I have preached many times now in front of a whole audience of people, strangers and friends and family. And no matter who they are, strangers, friends, and family, we know that we have the potential of putting them to sleep.
Yeah.
and
I have.
And
I never got offended when I looked out in the audience and I saw someone fast asleep. I thought, well, that's not their problem. That's my problem. I'm going to blame myself. In fact, I did that in school too. When my students would fall asleep, I never felt bad for them. I just felt bad for me.
Yeah, it's that happened once as well for me for preaching. And I remember seeing this older married couple in the front row. And as I'm preaching on Psalm 1, which is one of my favorite Psalms, I see both their heads tilt back and forth, that whole entire rocking motion. Yeah. And I was just like, oh dear, this is not going well.
Speaking of preaching, you've experienced this, I'm sure. I was stunned by it when I got into the pastorate and preached, regularly. How often I thought that my points were intriguing enough that the audience would be engaged. But when I would say, and I didn't mean it to be a different part of the sermon, shall we say, but I would say, a funny thing happened on the way to the store yesterday, and all the heads would jump up as though, now you're talking my language. So because I was pastoring and professoring at the same time for most of my professional life. And so in the lectern situation at school, you don't tell a lot of stories. You're always dealing with nuts and bolts and facts. In a sermon, I realized, and this took us some time, that what people really, and it's right on your point, that what people really want, or at least they naturally find themselves attracted to, is what happened as you went to the store yesterday, even though it has nothing really to do with the nuts and bolts of what you're talking about. But it just, all of a sudden, like I say, physically, if you're a preacher, you'll see this. When you start a story of any kind, even if it's, silly, the heads jump up, or all of a sudden you feel like you have them again, which is, again, that's not how I thought it would be, because I was a professor by trade in my head, and I thought that the information would be enough to keep people's attention. But maybe that's just human nature. But I like your point, and I'm with you on this, that the Bible is not bullet points. It's not arrows and, illustrations of things. It's a story that develops. And so as we get into this and continue to work our way through Divine Counsel Worldview, I'm with you on that and this is where theology itself, and we'll talk about this in another podcast, that writing a theology about the Divine Counsel Worldview is a challenge, because right there, that word is going to stick in our craw, as though to say, is the Bible an attempt at writing theology? And if it isn't, which I'm going to recommend, it really doesn't try to do that. It could have done a better job, shall we say, if it was trying to write a theology for us. But if the Bible includes a theology, how do you pull it out of there at the same time as honoring the stories that are happening? So a lot to say there, but we'll get to that in time. Let's get into Genesis 18. The key moment of 17, just to put our context in front of us, is, I think, verses 20 and 21. As for Ishmael, I have heard you, I have blessed him. Remember, the 20 is 17. Chapter 17 is talking about the story of Ishmael. And he says in 20, as for Ishmael, God is saying, I have heard you, I have blessed him, I will make him fruitful and multiply. But, verse 21, I will establish my covenant with Isaac. And the point being that coming into 18, God is trying to make clear to Abraham that as much as he likes Ishmael, I think there's that 13 years old kid sitting with Abraham at the end of the story, that Abraham wants Ishmael to be the son of the promise, the son of the covenant, and God is saying no. There's a story to be told with Ishmael, but the covenant, the back and forth way that I'm going to have with these two boys, it's going to be with only one of them, and the other one is going to go a different way. So that kind of sets up, again, the reader for a story to be watched for. And let's get into 18, which drops the story of Ishmael. Now we're going to get into a different story. So 18:1, 18:1. And the Lord appeared to him, that would be Yahweh appearing to Abraham, by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. The Lord appeared. Let me just, again, this is the third occurrence in our story, in the Bible, of Yahweh appearing. And let me just quickly, go through that, because I think there's a lot of discussion on that when it comes to a divine counsel worldview. In 12:7, it says Yahweh appeared to Abraham. We don't know how. It doesn't give any time to that. In 17:1, again, Yahweh appeared to Abraham. Verse 3 of 17 hints that it's a human. But this is the third occurrence then. The Lord appeared to him in 18:1. Coming up in 26:24, Yahweh appears to Isaac. And then it becomes not a common thing, but you can, I'm not going to go through them all, but like in Exodus 3:2, he appeared to Moses in this burning bush. By the way, the root word ra'ah in the Cal stem means to see, the active idea of seeing. Very common. Yahweh came down and saw, Genesis 6:5. Genesis 11:5, Yahweh came down the Tower of Babel. So that word to see, very common in Hebrew. In the Nephal stem is the reflexive or the passive voice. You would have appear. So it's the same word. It's not a magical word at all, a very common word. So whenever we hear of anyone appearing in the Bible, it's just the reflexive use of, or the passive use of the word to see. Okay.
And passive meaning that basically this is being done to the object, and the object being Abraham. So it happened to him. That was the way that I learned it from my Hebrew courses, was that the Nephal stem and other similar stems will actually be causing an action onto the object.
Yeah. And the point I'm making is that ra'ah is a very common word, and there's nothing magical in the word appearing there. It's just a common use of a common word. And what I'd like to do is save my opinion for how Yahweh appears to Abram in this story of Genesis 18 until the last verse, because at the end of our chapter, he's going to leave, as it were. So let me just go back at that point. When we get to the end of the story, I'd like to give you my opinion as to how this appearing would have worked in the life there of Abraham. Again, it's not a necessary part of the divine counsel worldview, but it certainly will be a conversation to have as to how this works, because what we're always up against, I'm finding, and this is how I'm attacking our studies here on this podcast, is which Elohim is in the story. And I think that's what, where the original reader would have been. And so how the world of Elohim, plural, worked in their world is, to me, always of interest on our podcast. But anyway, let's move on here. 18:2. He lifted his eyes, Abraham did, and looked, and behold, 3 men. Now, there's a hint that we're working with humans, and that word is ish, very common again, just the idea that he gets up off the ground and he has 3 men standing in front of him. Verse 3, and he said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. He's just he's just giving the standard greeting to a visitor. Verse 4, let a little water be brought and wash your feet. And rest yourselves under a tree. This is again for our world that we're entering here, a very common expression of hospitality. Mm-hmm. 5, I will bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. This was their version of the internet. I was reading one commentator talking about this as though in a world where you didn't have Motel 6s and you didn't have an internet, how did you get your news? Well, you probably had people coming through town, and so to have a visitor stopping in was important, even beyond the hey, how are you doing conversations. You'd make a meal, you'd take your time, and you'd get to know them because they have information that you probably want to hear. I'm done with verse 5. In fact, all the way up to verse 8 is simply talking about the preparation he makes for these 3 visitors that at which point in the story we don't know how they function. We just know that he thinks of them as men. So, well, interesting in verse 9, they said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? He said, she's in the tent. And then you have in 18:10, and in Hebrew it just says, he said, but the ESV puts in the Lord said because of verse 13, where you do have Yahweh said. So what the New King James has in 10 is simply he with a capital H. There you go again, shall we say, with a translation that wants us to, because the Hebrew just has he said, but the text is hinting, because of what's going to happen later, that one of them is Yahweh in some sense. And again, we'll get into that at the end of this podcast. But the he in 18:10 is now somehow being the Lord. So ESV 18:10, the Lord said, and listen to what he says, I will certainly or surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Sarah, verse 11, was old, advanced in years. We learned from 21:5, and compare that back to 17:1, that Abraham at this point is 99, which makes Sarah 89. So she's well advanced past childbearing as she says this. Sarah was listening. And verse 11, I just said that. The way of the women had ceased to be with Sarah, meaning, yes, she's not in childbearing age. Verse 12, so Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? And the Lord said, and here the text does include the name of Yahweh. Yahweh said to Abram. So what the writer is wanting the reader, and I'm sure the child listening to this, to do in their head is say, oh, so going back to 1 and 2, verses 1 and 2, the Lord appeared to Abram somehow through these 3 men, one of which now is talking as though he is Yahweh. So it just by way of listening to the story, we now have Yahweh talking as one of the 3 men. Mm-hmm. He says in verse 13, why did Sarah laugh? By the way, again, that laugh word, tzakak, is going to be used for Isaac. And so they're going to play off that word, tzakak, as we go, that she laughs thinking, well, I can't have a child at 89. And then she'll say later, I'm laughing because I'm so happy. So again, that's just how we get the name Isaac. I love 14. Is anything too hard for Yahweh? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. 15. Sarah denied it, saying, I did not tzakak. for she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh. So I should stop and ask anything up to this point, Mike, you want to comment on?
I find that it's a moment of humor, and actually, even earlier there was this, again, going back to what you're asking earlier about Bill Maher, like the story is brilliant because it starts off slow. There's a building of tension, and action begins happening. The moment when Abraham says, "Hasten" or "quick," as the listener, I'm imagining now, like there's now a flurry of activity that he's setting things up. Sarah is kneading bread and making food. That there's this activity that I'm imagining in my mind just from the moment he said hasten, that this was not planned. They did not expect 3 visitors to show up out of nowhere. And they're just quickly trying to show good hospitality.
Mm-hmm.
And these strangers are then bringing up something very surprising and almost essentially, wait, how do you know about my wife? How do you know about me? And you're saying there's a child that's coming? Wait a minute. and so I like how in verse 10, it just really is. He said, and so you don't know who the he is. It's leaving that tension. And then in 13, you get that it's Yahweh. It's Yahweh who's speaking, and all of a sudden it's like all the bricks, like in a Tetris game, are starting to fall into place, and everything's clicking. So it's very cool just to see how the narrative is working as it should be. That you're gaining more information.
It's neat how narrative can say something so fast that we know took all afternoon. So he took butter and milk and the calf, which he had, now that takes time. I mean, you slaughter a calf, right? So this is an all-day discussion or an all-day story that is put into literally, it took us how long to read it? 2 or 3 minutes. So yeah, beautiful storytelling. It's meant to capture the audience's ear, especially, again, I always think of the child sitting at the feet of his father listening to this. He's enraptured by what's going on, and he's being taught about his story through a very simple narrative that is powerful. So yeah, Bill Maher would look at this and say, how dumb. And we look at it and say, how cool. So welcome to our world that you and I find it fascinating, and I think many people do and should. All right, verse 16. And the men arose from there, and they looked toward Sodom. Now, we've already been told in 13:13 that Sodom was a wicked city. We were told in 14:12 that Lot, Abraham's nephew, lived there. By location, it's somewhere near the Dead Sea, south, the eastern or western side. We're not sure. Interesting, in the the Biblical Archaeology Review that I just got for summer 2024, one of the articles, a 1-page article called The Land of Lot. So that's one of the magazines I would recommend every Christian, not just Divine Counsel Worldview Christian, but any Christian, to me, you read cover to cover when it comes out, is the Biblical Archaeology Review. They do a wonderful job of, for the layman like me, tying archaeological discovery into biblical thought and discussion. What I like about Bar is that it appeals both to the hardcore evangelical conservative inerrantist, shall we say, or the liberal who doesn't even want to know much about the Bible, but they want to know about archaeology. It really speaks to both worlds, of both bookends, very well, and frankly, it's respected from both ends. But anyway, Sodom is mentioned in 18:16, and again, foretelling in the story is we've got something going on here with Sodom. They looked down towards Sodom, and off we go in the story. And Abraham went with them to set them on their way. And look at 18:17, the Lord said. So you get the sense that 2 men of the 3 walk on towards Sodom, and that one remains behind to talk with Abraham. And this starts the story moving forward. 18:18, seeing that Abraham, or 17, the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? You get the feeling that God is Yahweh is talking to himself before he says a thing to Abraham. Seeing that Abraham, he says in 18, shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. There's the reverberations of the original promise of 12:3. What God is thinking about doing with Abraham. The covenant, this is to me very interesting, that when God thinks of the promise he made to Abraham, yes, there's a side of it, there's a covenantal side of it. In fact, 19, let me read it. For I have chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of Yahweh by doing righteousness and justice, so that Yahweh may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. There is that sense in 19 that the covenant cuts both ways, that there's an implicit understanding of forfeiture on the side of either one of these two parties, that if you don't keep your part, the whole thing will fall apart. And so sometimes, again, we think of the Abrahamic, or I was taught that the Abrahamic covenant was one-sided. I don't sense that. I see in this kind of a rehearsal of God in his own mind, as it were, saying this is a both and, that I am going to bless this man and he is going to keep my ways as well. Kind of like a marriage vow again, where it's implicit that both sides are having a role to play. So, and by the way, 20, this is the three verses that I like to always think of when I think of the Abrahamic covenant: 18, 19, where you have that implied, both ways. 22:18 has this line when it comes to Abraham's responsibility. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. That's 22:18. And then 26 verse 5, well into the story again. In fact, he's already died by this point, but 26:5, looking back, Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my Torah. The idea that Abraham didn't come into his understanding of the covenant as though it's just Yahweh. This is something he kept as well. So just want to throw that out there again, that in this story, it's a which Elohim story. Which God did Abraham follow? That's what this is answering. It's not how well he followed. It's which one. And of course, Yahweh is always the answer to that. Ready for 20? By the way, anything more? Otherwise, I want to ask, well, you know what? Let me say something, Mike, and then it'll give you enough to respond, because I'm going to go after something here. Note also in verse 19, and it sounds so simple, but I find that I irk my Reformed friends when I talk like this. So try this out with your cohort and see how it goes. That Abraham in 18:19 is able to do tzedekah, righteousness, and mishpat, justice. He's able to do righteousness. And what, again, I grew up in my Reformed background is hearing really through Paul in the New Testament that righteousness is imputed because humans don't have the ability to do righteousness, quote, on their own. And I would just back off and say this and see, and again, I'm curious what you think of my shot at my Reformed friends when I say this, but a divine counsel worldview, as I understand it again, is committed to reading the Bible left to right. And in that case, if we're going to do that, there is no doctrine of imputed righteousness, because Paul, he's way down on the right side of that scale, right? Never meant to undo Genesis 18:19. I don't believe. In other words, we're going to get to a doctrine in the New Testament that some people will call imputed righteousness. Is Paul really trying to undo a story as clear as Genesis 18:19? I'd say no. So a simple question that, again, I pose to you, Mike, just on the fly here for you to jump at, is that when justice and righteousness, which are combined 96 times in the same verse in the Old Testament, righteousness and justice, they appear together 96 times in the Old Testament. And I looked through them all for a previous study that I did. Does any passage, here's a question I'm asking and answering, does any passage of the Old Testament say or imply that a person can't do righteousness and justice, whether it be because of depravity or the need to have it imputed? And the answer, in my estimation, and I got tons of verses to go through that I can't do here, is no, that people are doing righteousness and justice all the time. 2 Samuel 8:15, David did righteousness for his people. He did justice. Proverbs 16:8, it's commanded of us. And 21:3, Proverbs 21:3, it's commanded of a righteous or of a godly person to do tzedekah, righteousness. So here's my burden. Why would we want to turn a perfectly legitimate idea of a human doing righteousness on its ear and say, well, that can't be done? Unless, well, that's where am I missing something, Mike? Why would a New Testament scholar, be it Reformed or anybody else, want to ever undo such a beautiful story where humans in Genesis 18:19, like an Abraham, is commended for doing righteousness? Why would we undo that and say, well, you really can't, therefore it needs to be imputed? And then you get that whole story of the New Testament, Pauline doctrine of the imputation of righteousness. Am I missing something? And again, I taught that at one point. So I'm not speaking, I hope, from ignorance. I'm speaking from an honest, what happened? How did we get from a story into a doctrine that undoes the story?
this is a loaded question. So this is not going to be a comprehensive response or answer. I'm saying that, you know that, Ron, but I'm just saying that just for whoever's listening. So please don't impale me, our listeners, if I don't give a comprehensive response. I think one of, the presupposition is the insistence, especially from our Reformed fathers, right? They had, and I said this actually in a seminar we did at my church one time on, the topic was human sexuality, but I mentioned this little thing of how after studying church history and just kind of getting a feel of how Reformed theology had developed over the ages, it almost seems like at times we've carried on the emotional baggage of Luther and his vehement disdain for works righteousness in many ways was a reflection of what he felt as a burden from his experience as a monk in the Roman Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. And that ironically, it then got transposed onto the story of, Paul's, for example, Paul's road to Damascus moment, so many times. And I remember reading this in another scholarly essay that mentioned how even the way that we as Reformed Protestant Christians tend to look at the Damascus Road, we tend to look at it through the lens and the eyes of Luther, who saw it as his born again moment or his conversion moment, versus really, if we were taking into account Old Testament narratives and the way that it's described, what happened to Paul is more akin to the calling of a prophet.
Right. And he does that, by the way, in Philippians and in Galatians. He sees that as a calling, not as a conversion, but that's another discussion for another day.
And so that's what I mean. That I think there is this, there is this very fear that we could imply in any sort of way that we can earn our salvation or get to heaven, or however people like to describe it, by doing deeds. And so folks get nervous when they see verses like this. But my question would be, is it possible to do righteousness and justice if it is not directed towards the right God? Right. And I think that's sort of
now that's another question that's interestingly phrased to where I say, okay, now we've got another discussion on our hands. Yeah, that would be interesting.
And that's what I mean, that it's a loaded question, because what is assumed by the Reformed fathers, right, is that there is ultimately only one God that truly exists, and that's Yahweh. And so thus the question of, can you do righteousness and justice, they're not even factoring necessarily believing loyalty or allegiance to Yahweh. It all of a sudden becomes more of is it possible for anyone to actually do good stuff enough to earn their way into heaven? And that's not the question being asked here. The presumption in this verse is that it is in that covenant relationship between Abraham and Yahweh.
Yep.
And I think that's underlying what the speaker here is saying of the way of the Lord or the way of Yahweh by doing righteousness and justice, so that the righteousness and justice that is done is still affected, is still directed towards this particular God, Yahweh.
Right.
And so I think because we're coming at it from the perspective that any human being can choose and give their allegiance or their believing loyalty to not just Yahweh, but to any other divine being, any other spiritual being, that there are actual rivals, then that's why we're coming at it slightly differently. Because when I see this, I still see the faith, I still see the believing loyalty, because it's directed towards Yahweh.
Yep.
It's embodied action because of my deeply held belief inside that just is embodied. It has to be lived out naturally through my own life.
You've covered so much there, and I appreciate it, with the sense in my mind was spinning with thoughts as you were talking that, Luther and Calvin were answering, and this is an N.T. Wright quote, they answered well, but they were asking the wrong questions. That's his complaint against the reformers. In my study of history, church history, which I'm trying to do as I'm writing a book on a divine council theology, asking where did we get off the rails? My theory, which no one's ever asked that I know of in print, my theory is that by the time you get to Aquinas, 11th century, the question of other gods is so out of mind, because all his discussion is about there's only one. So his philosophical discussions in his Summa are always reflective of there's only one God, therefore let's talk about him, and everything comes from that discussion. Well, so after the 11th century or Aquinas, you never get the question, as you just said there, the which God question is never brought up again. So all of the theological discussion from the 12th century, I would say up to Mike Heiser's book, in 2017 well, again, that's maybe overstating it, because some liberals were already in that path. And Mike would say this, Dr. Heiser would say, I'm not saying anything new, right? He was simply pulling together things that had been said. But my point is, for an evangelical to look at the Bible asking which God is a question that we always need to think about. That was something that Dr. Heiser brought to the table. And my point is that, okay, well, let's do it. Let's just summarize where we've come in our conversation there, that in 18:19, Genesis 18:19, when it says that God is saying to himself that Abraham will do tzedakah and mishpat, righteousness and justice, that in the story of the Bible, reading left to right, the ability for a human to do righteousness and justice as they follow Yahweh is completely doable. That much has been stated. That much I would say we put down as a theological point that we don't move from. By the way, back in 15:6, we already found out this man is righteous in God's opinion because of his loyalty. So these are the kind of stakes that I drive in the ground as I work my way through the Bible, so that by the time I get to a Paul in the New Testament, and I hear people talk about imputed righteousness, here's me now, here's just my opinion, I'm going to stop and say, whoa, wait a second, are you undoing Genesis 18:19? If you are, I need evidence, I need textual evidence that helps me undo the entire story right up to the Apostle Paul. So we're getting too far into the New Testament in discussing that, but that to me is... Or this 18:19 to me is a kind of verse that I grab, and I don't think I'm taking it out of context. I'm taking it in the context of the story, that I put a stake in the ground and I say, can men do righteousness? Absolutely. It's part of the story of following Yahweh.
And can I add that, two thoughts. And one, immediately to what you're saying, I would say here is that Dr. Heiser liked to always, he was always very careful. Like he would get questions asked about, like, oh, do you think Roman Catholics or Greek Eastern Orthodox folks are saved, and like, what about all their work salvation? And he actually would respond back with, that depends if they believe, if the individual person actually thinks that, saying a rosary prayer or doing this particular, ceremony or ritual, that it merits something from God, that all of a sudden God now owes them something. Then,
and no one in the Bible does that. That's the point.
No.
That in our story, no one's holding a rosary or a crucifix or, doing a Eucharistic moment in the church. I mean, that storyline that Luther is reacting against is so after the Bible. It's so after the fact that I find it to be kind of a non sequitur question about how to think biblically.
Yeah. And so I think that's where we have to clarify that the ability to do righteousness and justice does not have the adjective of doing it perfectly. It is simply, you are doing it because of your loyalty, your love, your hesed for Yahweh. And the other thought that was also kind of running in my mind, it's a little bit of, folks sometimes are surprised when they find out that when I shared and started learning about a divine council worldview, when I shared it with my lead pastor, the same lead pastor that I my wife joined with to help plant the church that we're still in Quincy, he actually was quite open to the concept of the divine council because he is very involved in missions work. He's part of the missions committee for the entire denomination that the church is a part of. And he's gone to many places like India, where there are thousands and thousands of gods that are worshipped by millions, if not a billion different people. And he immediately got the idea of the divine council worldview is basically affirming the fact that Yahweh does have rivals. They're not equal rivals. They're not stronger or better than Yahweh, but they are rivals who are trying to grab the affection and loyalty and devotion of human beings. And so he totally grabbed onto that concept of the divine council because he was involved in missions work. And I find this more often, that when folks are actually exposed to the mission field, especially to areas that are outside of Europe, and they encounter actual religious systems that are rivals to Yahweh, they're a little bit more open to the divine council material, because all of a sudden they're seeing in reality that there is actual genuine competition. My competition is not the Ferrari that's parked outside. My competition is not, a career. My competition is actually the priest down the street who is telling people to worship Vishnu. Yeah. And that is the competition.
Thank you. And let's save this question about a pastor like yours who said, I'm open to divine council worldview. I'd like to make this the opening question to our next podcast as we lead into Genesis 19. And again, just as a general question to start our podcast with would be, when you're developing a divine council worldview, do you do it by addition or do you do it by another means? In other words, can this pastor, let's use your pastor whom I've never met as an example, can he add in a divine council worldview and keep everything else he already believes? Or does the divine council worldview necessarily bump up against other confessional, even creedal things that person now has to consider? So that's a big question that I would like to save for the beginning of our next podcast, if you don't mind. Sure. Verse 20, got to keep moving. Then the Lord said, as he's thinking to himself, now he turns and actually says to Abram in 20, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave. By the way, we don't know exactly what the sin of Sodom is. Now, sodomy, of course, is an English word, implies that it's a sexual deviancy of some kind. We're never actually told in the text that it's sexual immorality, but we have strong traditions that way. What we do notice is the sin very grave idea, that some sins are worse than others. That, again, is a biblical story. That's always been part of the story of Scripture, that you can sin in different ways and some are worse than others. 21, I will go down now to see whether they have done together altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know. It makes, Yahweh look like he's actually going to open the heavens and look in and see what's going on. So, verse 22, the men turned from there, the two men that are with Abram, and went toward Sodom. But Abraham stood still before Yahweh. There's that third person of those three that he is talking to, who is now identified as Yahweh. Then Abraham drew near and said to Yahweh, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? There's that word righteous now. Again, very common word, sadiq, is the same form of tzedekah, same root. Sadiq is 206 times in the Old Testament, very common word. Again, it's not even a religious word. It just means proper. And then he uses the other end of the bookend, the wicked, Rasha, 262 times. Again, very common. That's my point. They are paired. Righteous and wicked are paired 78 times in the Old Testament, as though it's a standard bookend way of saying from here to there. The righteous all the way over to the wicked, like Psalm 1:6. The Lord knows the way of the tzaddik, but the way of the rasha will perish. So this combination of righteous and wicked is, again, I'm just trying to say is standard form for the Hebrew speaker to say bookends of the story. What again I'm concerned about is that in our New Testament discussions, we often will use the word wicked or ungodly for all humans. But notice here it does not mean that. It's, because we, again, in the New Testament, most Reformed thinkers see, Romans trying to argue that for all have sinned. In other words, thus we're all ungodly, we're all wicked. I understand that. I'm just saying that in the vocabulary use of the word wicked in the Old Testament, that is not an Abraham. Abraham is never considered to be wicked because he's not a non-Yahwist. And that to me is much deeper discussion. So anyway, for Abraham, a righteous person was a Yahweh loyalist. My guess would be that wasn't how everyone used the term, because again, it's very standard. It's kind of a stock word. But watch again how this is going to play out. In the story here, what Abraham is concerned about is that, are you going to be unfair? And I love 25. I've often used it as kind of just a truism in how I respond to my own questions or the questions of others about what God is going to do with something or about something. Here's what he says. Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the right, this is Abraham talking, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. And I love this line. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is mishpat? He's pulling that word out of verse 19, justice and righteousness. Will not the judge of all the earth always do what is proper for the moment? And that's usually how mishpat is used, kind of a specific ordinance or rule or law given to a specific situation. I just find, again, in the story of Scripture here, that Abraham, as little as he knows about Yahweh, maybe from a theological point of view, he doesn't have Torah yet. He's not working with a written document, that describes who Yahweh is. He simply can say to him, here's what I've learned about you so far in my own experience. You always do the right thing. Which, by the way, again, saying that to a deity at this point in the story is bizarre, because this is not standard way. This is not a standard way you would talk to a deity at this point in whether it be how you would have talked to Melkart in Babylon or any other deity that a person worshipped. You would never have the confidence to look into the heavens and say, I know one thing, you'll always do the right thing. Because again, the gods were notoriously, wicked, or at least passionate, and could do very wicked things at at different times. So I just love this line. It tells me that Abraham is onto something when it comes to the character of the God that he has chosen to follow. So otherwise, I'm not going to read it, but from here to the end of the chapter, up to verse 32, in other words, you get this 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10 thing.
Yeah.
I love how 27 kind of introduces it as, and this is where Bill Maher made fun of it, and I'm finding it to be just the opposite. Abraham says, 1827, "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to Adonai," another way of saying the Lord or my Lord. "I am but dust and ashes." He introduces this, can I go for 45? Can I go for 40? And on down. He does it as though, and here's Isaiah 41:8. He does it as though he's talking to a friend. Okay, and that's where we get the Abraham, my friend, Isaiah 41:8, and that's picked up by James, is it chapter 2, where Abraham is called the friend of God. The idea that Abraham could talk to the creator of the universe as though he's talking to a friend is, to Bill Maher, weird. To the reader of this story, it sends shivers down your spine. It's like, you've got to be kidding me. I can talk to my creator as though I'm talking to a friend, and to which the writer is trying to say, absolutely. This isn't silly. This is bizarrely beautiful. And that's why I introduced our podcast with that question, because to me, 27 is beautiful. To me, or to a convinced agnostic like Maher, it's nutty. But I just, beautiful line there. And this is what brings us then to anything else you want to bring up, by the way, as we get to the end of the chapter. Otherwise, I'm going to take the last verse, Mike, and give you my opinion about how the Lord appeared to Abraham.
Well, if I guess I'll start with my response with a question to you. Have you ever gotten the chance to read J. Richard Middleton's, I think let me get the title correct, Abraham's Silence, the binding of Isaac, the suffering of Job?
I like the title. I think I have it in my library, but it's one of those books that's on that big stack called I'll Get There When I Get There.
Well, I would definitely exhort you to move it
Abraham's
higher
Silence,
on the top.
you call it?
Abraham's Silence.
Okay, let me take
he
a look.
has this book is brilliant on so many levels. He has a section where he talks about this particular episode of Abraham, and very subtly, I didn't understand it at the time, but he brought up how, yes, as Abraham is responding back to Yahweh, he mentions the moment of that he is dust and ashes, and he's making part of his argument throughout his book is that Abraham and Job are essentially placed as two paradigms against one another. That Job, in his mind, is actually a corrective of, in some sense, the failure of what Abraham was supposed to learn in this moment.
Okay.
And so he points back to the fact that Abraham says the phrase dust and ashes, because later in the sense of, if we keep reading the Bible and we get to the book of Job, Job's last lines to God, in Job 42:6, in the ESV it translates, "Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." It's the same phrase. Middleton personally translates that verse 6 differently. He translates it as, "Therefore I recant and I take comfort in dust and ashes."
Okay.
That's another discussion for another time.
Yeah,
but
I see the point, though. I like that.
He's making the point that Abraham is doing what is a very common kind of thing of like the 50, the 30, going down, but he stops at 10.
Right.
And he doesn't go down to what would naturally happen right afterwards, is down to 1.
Right.
He stops at 10. And in many ways, he's not pushing back hard enough against God of, will you really do something like this? And so he brings up here in this section of chapter 18, he mentions a few other scholars, and he points out that there seems to be something that Yahweh was trying to teach Abraham about his character, about himself. And John Levison, he quotes, refers back to Jeremiah 5:1, and is essentially this concept that a prophet, that God is instructing Jeremiah, you can't say anything anymore to me, because his natural propensity is to actually show mercy. and that it basically implies, from Middleton's perspective, that if Abraham went down to 1, God would have, all right, I won't do it because you asked me for 1.
It's interesting that the word mercy, chesed, in Hebrew will occur for the first time in chapter 19, when he pulls Lot out by chesed, as though, here we go, this is the kind of God we have, that in destroying Sodom, he does pull out what 2 Peter 2 seems to imply is the only righteous person there. So, but that's another conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, Middleton says at the end of this suggests that God might forestall destruction of a wicked city for just 1 righteous person. That Abraham stops at 10, however, suggests that he hasn't fully plumbed the depths of divine mercy. He has not yet learned what God wanted to teach him. Nevertheless, God rescues Lot and his family through angelic agency, even though Abraham hadn't thought to ask for that outright.
Right.
So anyways, that was just the thought as we were talking about it. Middleton's work is still something I'm processing. I keep going back to it every so often because
I just looked up, I don't have that book. So
yeah, it's incredible of just seeing, and even how in rabbinic tradition, there was always this kind of back and forth between Abraham and Job, like who is the more righteous one. And in the end, the rabbinic commenters would say, well, Abraham's the one who wins. Because there's no bias, but Abraham wins because Job is technically a Gentile.
True.
And so there was that little bit of like, how do we feel about a righteous Gentile here? And,
well, there you go with your Cornelius question of the New Testament. How are we going to handle this guy?
Yeah. And so anyways, I just wanted to bring that up because I am still so fascinated by just the exegetical work that Middleton did. And I love that he pointed this out, that Abraham is acting like a prophet. He's standing in the gap for a people that he had only known very superficially. He helped save their possessions because he was trying to save his nephew.
He will be called a prophet in 20 verse 7, Abraham.
Yeah. And so for the sake of 1 person, like he could have asked, but he didn't. And it's just like that question is just left ambiguous as to why he didn't go down to 1.
A question that people reading the story would have, or hearing the story would have probably asked, why didn't he go down to 1?
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me finish with the last verse of 18. The Lord went his way when he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. So in the video version, you got 2 guys turning and walking away from each other, one being Yahweh. Okay? So the Lord appeared to Abraham in 17:1, 18:1, and now here. So throughout this story, what are the options when it comes to Yahweh appearing? I have 4 options, Mike, and I wrote these out, on the fly as though I'm trying just to remember how this conversation has gone through those who have read Mike's works and those who have, studied commentaries and such throughout the history. When it comes to Yahweh appearing, here are the 4 options that I'm aware of. Number 1, Yahweh himself, in the sense that he leaves heaven, the dimension of heaven, or what we call heaven, and comes into bodily form. It's the traditional view of a theophany. The problem, as stated that way to view number 1, is that are we saying that God is actually not locatable anywhere else in the universe except in that 1 6-foot human figure? When expressed that way, most theologians get antsy, if not uncomfortable. So again, view number 1, no one really takes that I'm aware of, where Yahweh vacates all dimensions of existence and locates himself specifically and only in a 6-foot figure. So I don't sense number 1 is very common when you really get into it. Number 2, another option. There are 2 Yahwehs, one who remains in another non-physical dimension and one who takes up residence at times in our physical world. I know that's, when I say 2 Yahwehs, those who know Mike's or Dr. Heiser's work will hear that in his writings. This is a Jewish view in the sense that Alan Segal and others have gone down the path of saying that Yahweh in their world could exist in 2 modes at one time. So in our story, In other words, you'd take, going back to 18:17 through 21, Yahweh said, as though he's talking from heaven, since Abraham will, I have known him. Then you get to 21, I will go down now. And then in 22, though, you have Abraham stood still before Yahweh. So the two Yahweh view would work with in that story. Verses 17 through 21 would be one Yahweh, and then the other Yahweh would be in 22. So that's, and I just pose it as an option. A third option would be that this is a pre-incarnate Jesus. That when it says Yahweh here, this is what would be a second person of the yet unknown Trinity, speaking as the same essence of Yahweh, though as a different person than Yahweh. Now that would be, and here's where kind of Mike would probably put his hand up again and say, that's me, because this is a Christian view of version number 2. You can do the version number 2, the two Yahweh thing, and stay completely Jewish. You don't have to think in Christian terms at all. In the third view, which I just gave, now you're bringing in the possibility of the second person of the Godhead to be that second Yahweh. So that would be, so number 3 here is kind of a Christian view of number 2. And then you have a subset of even this view that says, well, this is the angel of Yahweh. And now you have a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus in the angel of Yahweh, which again is an option. I'm not saying it's good or bad yet. I'm just saying this is one of the options that we have within this rather convoluted question of how does Yahweh appear. So the fourth option is, this is the only other option I'm aware of. So if there's more, let me know. But following through, here's the fourth option, following through on the ancient understanding of agency, or how human and divine messengers functioned in the ancient world. This would be a messenger, possibly a divine being, who, when speaking, uses the first person, I, for Yahweh, while not being Yahweh. So in this sense, the word appeared would get used this way as well. So that now, in this view, Yahweh appearing would be another way of saying an agent of Yahweh, whether it be a human or a divine being, was there in front of Abraham. So those are the 4, if not 4.5 possible views. Am I missing? And again, I'm just dropping this on you, Mike, but are those 4.5 views making sense? And am I missing anything obvious?
I think that covers the majority. I'm trying to remember, because I would say that, Mike, the Dr. Heiser, he would, he leaned towards 2 and 3. It was a combo, because the Greco-Roman, or I guess Western and even Eastern Orthodox way of thinking of the Trinity, 3 persons, 1 essence, or 1 being. I think Dr. Heiser would have used Yahweh as another substitute word for Godhead, that Yahweh, Godhead were equivalent, essentially. Okay. That, because he eventually taught courses of the Jewish Trinity, and going into Seagull's work, Seagull essentially went into this research called the Two Powers Doctrine, right, where Jewish readers are trying to understand what seems to be if there's Yahweh in heaven, why in the world are we seeing a Yahweh on earth? And, they're drawing from other ancient Near Eastern ideas of essentially co-regency of the ultimate God. And then Baal, for example, would be seen as this co-regent and equal in power and status and, authority and rights. And so that was the kind of concept that was going through. Seagull essentially pointed out that in the end, rabbinic commentators and rabbinic teachers, after the temple was destroyed, they eventually called the two doctrine, the two powers doctrine a heresy. A lot of it being because Christians, Jewish Christians who knew about this, were using
they filled in the slot of the second Yahweh with an obvious storyline that the Jews post 70 AD did not believe in, right?
Yep. And then eventually, even that if you have a 2 powers, you can have a 3 powers, because then you can bring in the Holy Spirit as the third power, the third Yahweh. And then, that's eventually, I remember one of the projects that Mike had told me about before was he had contracted someone to dig into a lot of the early church fathers' materials, especially as early as you could possibly trace it to closer to the apostles. And some of that research seems to show that they understood at least a rudimentary level a divine counsel worldview, the two powers ideas. But of course, you have the language barrier creeping up that slowly made it harder to continue that information transfer.
Yeah, and a lot of those
fascinating.
A lot of those church fathers, as I still read them, they don't spend a lot of time in the Old Testament as though it's an important theological way of looking at life. I mean, well, how do I say that? They so quickly get into their problems, their issues of how to define Jesus and the Father. That becomes an early, controversy and such. And the Mass, the means of, this is Augustine and the Donatist controversy of who has the right to give the Mass to the person. Is it the Mass itself that's valuable, or is it the person giving it to you? In other words, those are questions to me that are so far beyond the biblical story that, anyway. Thank you. Let me close this then with giving you my opinion. And again, the temptation for anyone giving their opinion is that the misunderstanding is that you could hear this and say that I don't like the other views, therefore you have to have my view. I'm not saying that. I'm just giving you my impression of how, and Mike and I talked about this all the time. So I'm hopefully letting the listener in on many private conversations that I had with Dr. Heiser about this very issue, because it's very important, obviously, when you get into the New Testament and how Jesus fits in. But here's my understanding or my opinion on the Yahweh appearing stories that we've had so far. I like number 4, that Yahweh appears and it implies agency. And here's my defense, if I can just give it to you quick. In Leviticus 9, verse 4, you have this verse. Also a bull and a ram is a peace offering to sacrifice before Yahweh, and a grain offering mixed with oil. For today, quote, the Lord will appear to you. Leviticus 9:4. Then reading on, so they brought what Moses commanded before the tabernacle of meeting, and all the congregation drew near and stood before Yahweh. Same language as we just had, this appearing language. Verse 6, then Moses said, this is the thing which the Lord commanded you to do, and the glory of Yahweh will appear to you. Same word there, appear. So you go from Yahweh appearing to the glory of Yahweh appearing, as though the reader at least is given the impression that the Shekinah counts as Yahweh in some way. Then 23, Leviticus 9 still. Then the glory of Yahweh appeared to all the people, and fire came out from before Yahweh. So just that back and forth between before Yahweh or before the glory of Yahweh, as though the reader is equating one with the other. When the men of Israel are told on 4 occasions in Torah to come to, quote, appear before Yahweh 3 times a year, that's in Exodus 23:17, 34:23, Deuteronomy 16:16, and Deuteronomy 31:11. 4 times we have that same idea of all the males coming 3 times a year to appear before Yahweh. And then in a specific case, we're ordered where 2 men are ordered to, quote, appear before the Lord during a court case, Deuteronomy 19:17. In these cases, from what I can sense in the text, when they were appearing before the Lord, they were appearing before an agent of the Lord. So like in Numbers 19 or 16:19, the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. Same as in 16:42 and 20 verse 6. In that court case, and I'd recommend anyone to look at this because it's pretty clear to me and it's very direct in Deuteronomy 19, Deuteronomy 19 verse 17. Then both men of the controversy shall stand before Yahweh, quote, or comma, before the priests and the judges who serve in those days. It just seems the text is trying to say that when you stand before Yahweh, comma, you're standing in a sense before the priests and the judges, as though that's appositionally trying to define what it means as to stand before Yahweh. So, and, 1 Samuel 1, fascinating text, which we won't take time to go to, but I'd recommend anyone who wants to get into this question that the interplay between Hannah and Samuel when she bears him and bringing him to the Lord, whether it's sacrifice to the Lord, pray to the Lord, pour out my soul to the Lord, worship in front of, offer a vow to the Lord. You have a lot of to the Lord language in 1 Samuel 1. And then you even have 122. It says he appeared before the Lord. In 128, she lent Samuel to the Lord. But the point is, in 125, she brought the child to Eli. And I get the sense, if you just read the text, that Eli is counting and the tabernacle is counting as Yahweh in that kind of discussion, just through this concept of divine agency. Other examples would be, and again, this gets really into the text, but if anyone wants to study this out, here's where I would go. 1 Samuel 3:21 and the first verse of chapter 4, verse 1. The Lord appeared again in Shiloh, for the Lord revealed, different verb, himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the davar, the word, the matter, the thing of Yahweh. And then the next line, and the davar of Samuel came to all Israel. The davar meaning the word of, or defined as the word of. And back in 3:19, it says that none of Samuel's words, davarim, fell to the ground. So my paraphrase of 3:21 is, the Lord revealed himself. He appeared again by Samuel's words, which always came true. I think that's how they would have understood that in that line there. Fascinating story. Again, for time, I'm just going to recite the text. 1 Chronicles 21, verses 14 through 28. Yahweh sent a plague upon Israel, and in that story, a messenger, a malach, meets David, as well as a prophet by the name of Gad. So David sees a messenger, a malach, and a prophet. But then in the same rendition of the story in the parallel passage of 2 Chronicles 3:1, which is just one verse overviewing that whole story of 1 Chronicles 21, it just says Yahweh appeared to David. So again, back in the 21 of 1 Chronicles, you don't have Yahweh appearing at all, but in 1 Chronicles 3:1, it's summarized by saying Yahweh appeared to David. And my guess would be through that malach and through the prophet. One more. This gets into the before the Lord language. Again, you just type into your computer software a quote before the Lord, Yahweh, and see what it brings up. And you have a lot of that stuff, that someone stood before the Lord dozens of times in the Old Testament. And yet the parallel passages along the way often have, they stood before the glory of the Lord, the ark of the Lord, before the altar of the Lord, so those kind of things. So and again, I have too many texts to cite, but my view is in that discussion of Yahweh appearing in the Old Testament, here's my point, that Yahweh sent or can send an agent or appear as an agent, whether it be a man, a divine being, an altar, a physical thing, a glory cloud, and all of those count for this appearing before kind of a thing. So in 18:1, here's how I read it as we get back to the point of what all that was for. Was it when it says Yahweh appeared before Abraham, it just means that one of those three men were sent by Yahweh. Well, all three men are sent by Yahweh, but one of them counts as, and by the way, at the end of 19, we're going to see one of those two men left over. Let me see if I can say that more clearly. Of the three men that appear in 18:1 or 18:2, one of them speaks as Yahweh in 18. Then in 19, which we'll do next time, of the two men that go into Sodom, one of those guys, verse 19:21, starts speaking as Yahweh again. So who can speak for Yahweh? My quick answer would be anyone who Yahweh sends. That's the fourth view of the four. that anyone who is sent by Yahweh gets to say, quote, Yahweh said, and even use the word I in their conversation. So I'll leave it there as we close this podcast up. Any thoughts, Mike?
Well, I mean, I think I would just simply, like, I'll just give my hot take about this.
Yeah.
Because also just know, like, in the back of my mind, I'm also thinking of like how later traditions will also interpret these kind of things. I think one interesting concept, and I actually asked Mike before about in chapter 19, if one of those two was one of the other Yahwehs. And, he thinks at the very basic, we have that they are messengers, but it is curious that one of them seems to be talking like as though he was Yahweh. I do remember in my classes on Eastern Christianity, one of the ways that this chapter and then chapter 19 has been interpreted was that all three of the visitors were actually Yahweh.
Right.
That
I think any of the three could have said I. Yeah.
That the Father, Son, Holy Spirit were there, and that two of them, we don't know which one.
I see.
Yeah,
what if four had shown up and they all said I? Would that destroy that view?
Probably, but it's funny because I think ultimately what you brought up, like just the four major views, is that there is ambiguity in the text, right? Mm-hmm. Because the other thing that's running through my mind is that there is also a factor of language does move and change in meaning as we progress further, right? Because here in chapter 18, there is no priests, there is no Ark of the Covenant, there is no Mount Sinai or a cloud to come down. It is simply Abraham is stated that he stood before the Lord, but yet there is no ark, there is no tent poles, there is nothing else there. Mm-hmm. And so then the question is, what did he stand before? And yes, it could be just a divine agent, could be a malak, could be a human being who represents Yahweh, who's speaking on his behalf. But at the same time, there's ambiguity in text. And again, that's going back to what I've been reading and getting ready for my cohort. That's the beauty, and also it's the blessing and cursing of language and of spoken word. The moment you say it, there's always going to be a certain shape and form, but there's also always going to be some sense of ambiguity. And the narrator is telling a story. The narrator is not concerned with trying to nail down this particular identity of the person. It's supposed to leave you with a sense of tension and mystery. I personally do lend towards the second and third option, like Dr. Heiser did. Okay. But I also know folks like you and also other scholars who have pointed out that they're uncomfortable with the idea of the angel of the Lord being a pre-incarnation of Jesus, because for some of them, they would see it as a cheapening of the actual real incarnation that we see in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And so when I hear that pushback, I can sympathize. I understand. I get it. Like you're trying to guard something that is really precious, that is really miraculous. Yeah. And from cheapening it in any shape or form from Old Testament texts. So I get it. So, and I think there is just that ambiguity that is just in the text.
And the beauty of this then is, again, I hope people are sensing this, that you and I can have differing views, but we're understanding why we have the different views. And we don't have to. It's so much of my college training and even seminary training was to pillar, or what's the word I want here? To win the argument by slamming your opponent, especially in an unfortunate or unfair way. That was very common because we were the only people in the room. So to talk about the opponent without them being able to be there and defend themselves for me, it got very tiring. And I appreciate this, that we can talk it through and give the options and say, here's why good people land on various things. I think you just have to do that way. I always, who was the first person who said this? Maybe Lewis did, but he's probably quoting someone else. But always state your opponent's view to their liking. Always state your opponent's view to their liking. Before you go after it, you turn to your opponent and say, did I say it the way you would have said it? And as soon as they finally say, yes, that's exactly what I mean, now you can go after it, but not until, so. And that's hopefully what people are catching in our conversation. So
I'll caveat that I think, I have one of my closest friends, we both grew up in the same youth ministry at the Chinese Heritage Church that I became a Christian in. I'm in Boston, and he and I have many conversations in the past before of just the simple reality that my region is a very, not just postmodern, but a very post-Christian region. And like, we really do grab onto that model, or that phrase of unity in the fundamentals, grace on non-essentials, and it's just, there's so few of actual like loyal followers of Jesus, of loyal followers of Yahweh, and whatever kinship and friendship we can build within a region where it's so vehemently post-Christian.
Yeah.
Like, to us, that's the priority, not about, defending or trying to tear each other down, because a win for any of us is a win for all of us in our region. And so I think that's, again, going back to to what we were talking about missions and how missions work, I think is critical in helping maintain that sense of importance. Mm. We are still in the midst of fighting and contending for really the loyalties of our people to worship the one creator God.
Yeah.
And in my region, any friendship that I can have, even if they are whatever denomination that they may have, and I may not necessarily believe everything or agree with them on everything, but they worship the same Lord.
Yeah.
And I am not going to disparage them, just as they will not disparage me, because there's so few of us here. There's so no reason to have sidewalk curb fights when the curb is pretty much all owned by everything else under the sun.
Fair enough. Great. Well, thank you. And we'll pick up 19 next time. So we'll talk to everybody then. Thanks again for hanging around as long as you did to listen to Genesis 18 and the conversation we had together. Have a wonderful day, and we'll talk next time.